There is a moment quiet, unsettling, impossible to ignore, when everything you thought gave your life meaning suddenly feels hollow. Not after failure, not after loss, but right in the middle of what you once prayed for. You're doing well. You're functioning. You're admired. And yet, late at night, when the noise finally fades, a question rises like a whisper from somewhere deep inside. If I stop striving, if I stop proving, would anything about me still matter? That question is not a weakness. It's a crack. And through that crack, something life-changing begins to appear. What if the purpose you've been chasing your entire life was never meant to be found? What if it has been quietly unfolding hidden in how you breathe, how you suffer, how you live this whole time? This story does not begin with answers. It begins at the edge of certainty. And if you stay until the end, you may realize that the ending you were searching for was never meant to arrive. It was meant to be lived. If this kind of reflection speaks to your heart, please subscribe to Buddhism in every moment. Your support helps this channel continue creating calm, honest, life-changing stories that meet you right where you are. Stay with us. The most important part has just begun. Part 1: The quiet question we all carry. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot touch. It doesn't come from working too much or resting too little. It settles deeper than the body, somewhere behind the ribs, where thoughts echo when the world finally goes quiet. Many people feel it without having words for it. They wake up, go through the motions, meet expectations, fulfill responsibilities, and yet something inside them remains strangely untouched by their own lives. Outwardly, everything may look fine. Bills are paid, schedules are full, messages are answered. From the outside, life appears functional, even successful. But inwardly, a subtle unease lingers, like background noise that never fully disappears. It shows up in small moments, staring at the ceiling before sleep, pausing a little too long at a red light, feeling a sudden heaviness in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. And then, without warning, a question appears. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. What is all of this really for? This question doesn't arrive because something has gone wrong. It often comes precisely when things are going right. When the goals you chased are finally within reach. When the life you built starts to resemble the life you were told to want. That is what makes the question so unsettling. It feels almost ungrateful to ask it. Almost dangerous. So many people learn to push it away. They tell themselves they're just tired, or bored, or unmotivated. They scroll faster, work harder, plan the next milestone. They promise themselves that clarity will come after the next promotion, the next move, the next achievement, the next version of themselves. And for a while, the noise of doing keeps the question at bay. But the question doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits in the quiet moments that productivity cannot fill. It waits in the spaces between accomplishments. It waits in the realization that even when you are busy, admired, and needed, you can still feel strangely absent from your own life. This is not a personal failure. It is a human experience. Modern life is expertly designed to keep this question hidden. From an early age, many people are taught to measure life by progress. Forward motion becomes the highest virtue. To pause too long is seen as weakness. To slow down is framed as falling behind. Worth becomes tangled with usefulness, identity with productivity, meaning with output. Over time, something subtle happens. Life stops being something we inhabit and becomes something we manage. Days turn into tasks, weeks into deadlines, years into resumes. And somewhere along the way, the simple experience of being alive, of feeling breath move in and out, of noticing the weight of a moment, gets pushed aside by the pressure to become someone, to arrive somewhere, to justify the space we occupy. This is where the quiet question begins to grow roots. It is not asking for a grand philosophical answer. It is not demanding a spiritual revelation. At its core, the question is tender and deeply personal. Am I actually living, or am I just performing life? Many people have moments where this realization slips through. Sitting alone after a long day, surrounded by the glow of screens that promise connection but rarely deliver presence. Standing in a crowd where everything is loud, yet nothing feels intimate. Walking through a familiar neighborhood and suddenly feeling like a stranger to one's own routine. In these moments, life feels oddly flat. Not painful enough to demand change, but not fulfilling enough to feel real. And that is perhaps the most dangerous place to be comfortably disconnected. From the perspective of Buddhist wisdom, this quiet unease is not a problem to be fixed. It is a signal to be listened to. The teachings do not approach this question with urgency or pressure. They do not rush to give answers. Instead, they invite something far more radical. In a world obsessed with solutions, they invite you to pause. To notice what is actually happening inside you. The Buddha never framed life as a puzzle that must be solved in order to be valid. He did not suggest that meaning is something hidden far away, reserved for those who figure out the correct formula. Instead, his teachings point again and again to a simple, unsettling truth. Much of our suffering begins when we stop experiencing life directly and start living inside ideas about what life should be. The quiet question we carry is born in that gap. The gap between who we are and who we think we must become. The gap between living and constantly evaluating our lives. The gap between presence and performance. This is why the question often feels uncomfortable. It threatens the structure we've built. If we truly listen to it, we might have to admit that much of what we've been chasing was never about joy or meaning in the first place. It was about safety, approval, belonging, control. The question asks us to look honestly at the cost of always striving. What happens to the heart when every moment is measured by what it leads to? What happens to the mind when rest feels undeserved unless it is earned? What happens to the soul when being alive no longer feels like enough? These are not questions meant to induce guilt. They are invitations, gentle ones, invitations to notice how often we postpone life in exchange for an imagined future where everything will finally make sense. Buddhist insight offers a quiet but profound shift here. It suggests that meaning does not arrive at the end of effort. It does not wait behind achievement. It is not granted once we become the right version of ourselves. Meaning begins to appear the moment we stop running from the present moment and start meeting it honestly. This does not mean giving up responsibility or ambition. It means questioning the unconscious belief that life must justify itself through constant improvement. It means seeing how deeply we have absorbed the idea that existing is not enough, that we must always be adding, proving, becoming. The quiet question we carry is not asking us to abandon our lives. It is asking us to return to them. To feel what it's like to be here, now without immediately turning the experience into a judgment. To notice the subtle tension that arises when we believe our worth is conditional. To sense how much effort it takes to maintain the image of having everything together. When we allow ourselves to stay with this question without rushing to silence it, something unexpected happens. The question begins to soften. It loses its edge. It stops demanding answers and starts revealing patterns. We begin to see how often we live ahead of ourselves. How rarely we inhabit the moment we are actually in. How the search for purpose has quietly pulled us away from the simple experience of being alive. This is not a failure of discipline or motivation. It is a misunderstanding of what life is asking of us. Life, as Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us, is not a task to complete. It is a process to participate in, and participation requires presence, not perfection. The quiet question we all carry is not there to torment us. It is there to wake us up, to show us that something essential has been overlooked, to remind us that before we become anything, before we accomplish anything, before we explain anything, we are already here, breathing, sensing, living. And that may be the most important place to begin. Part 2: When purpose becomes pressure. At some point, the idea of purpose quietly changes its shape. What once felt like a source of inspiration begins to feel like a demand. What once offered direction slowly turns into an invisible standard you must live up to. Without noticing when it happened, purpose stops being something that guides you and becomes something that judges you. You don't wake up one day and decide this. It happens gradually, almost politely. You tell yourself you're just being responsible, that you're motivated, that you want to make the most of your time. From the outside, it looks admirable. From the inside, it begins to feel heavy. The pressure shows up in subtle ways. Rest no longer feels restorative. It feels suspicious. Stillness no longer feels peaceful. It feels unproductive. Even joy carries an undertone of anxiety, as if you're enjoying something you haven't fully earned. In a culture that celebrates momentum, slowing down can feel like a quiet failure. There is an unspoken message that runs beneath much of modern life: if you are not moving forward, you are falling behind. Purpose, under this belief, becomes a finish line. Something ahead of you. Something you are constantly approaching but never quite reaching. This is where suffering begins to take root. Not because having goals is wrong, not because effort is harmful, but because purpose has been turned into a measuring stick for worth. And when worth is measured, it is never stable. From a Buddhist perspective, this is a critical moment. Not a dramatic collapse, but a subtle misunderstanding. The teachings do not say that intention or effort is the problem. They point instead to something much quieter and more dangerous: attachment. Attachment to outcomes. Attachment to identity. Attachment to the idea that your life must add up to something impressive in order to be valid. When purpose becomes pressure, the mind narrows. Life begins to feel like a series of evaluations. Every choice is weighed against an invisible question: is this leading me where I'm supposed to go? Moments are no longer lived fully. They are assessed for their usefulness. Even meaningful experiences can feel strangely hollow if they don't seem to advance the story you think your life should be telling. This is why so many people feel exhausted, even when they are doing everything right. They followed the advice. They worked hard. They stayed disciplined. They kept going. And yet, the sense of arrival never comes. There is always another goal, another version of success, another expectation waiting just beyond the horizon. The moment one milestone is reached, the relief is brief. Almost immediately, a new tension takes its place. What's next? What more should I be doing? Who do I need to become now? From the outside, this looks like ambition. Inside, it often feels like fear. Fear of wasting potential. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of stopping long enough to realize how tired you truly are. Buddhist insight offers a clear and compassionate lens here. It teaches that suffering arises not from wanting to grow, but from clinging to the belief that your value depends on where that growth leads. When the mind ties identity to achievement, it creates a fragile foundation. Anything that threatens progress begins to feel like a threat to the self. This is why purpose, once it becomes rigid, starts to suffocate rather than support. The heart senses this long before the mind admits it. You may feel it as restlessness that no accomplishment seems to soothe, or as guilt when you're not using your time well enough, or as a quiet panic when you imagine slowing down without a clear plan. The pressure does not shout, it whispers. constantly. You should be doing more. You could be better than this. Don't fall behind now. Over time, this internal voice becomes so familiar that it feels like truth. But Buddhist wisdom invites you to look closely at it, not to fight it, but to understand it. When you do, you begin to see that this voice is not rooted in clarity. It is rooted in grasping. Grasping for certainty in an uncertain world. Grasping for control in a life that constantly changes. Grasping for a stable sense of self in experiences that are inherently fluid. Purpose turns painful when it is used to protect the ego from impermanence. The Buddha spoke often about impermanence, not as a threat, but as a fact of life that, when resisted, becomes a source of suffering. Careers change. Bodies age. Interests shift. Circumstances unravel. When purpose is built on the assumption that life must move in a straight, predictable line, every change feels like a disruption instead of a natural unfolding. This is why people often feel most lost, not when they fail, but when the path they committed to no longer fits who they are becoming. The pressure comes from believing that turning back or changing direction means something has gone wrong. But nothing has gone wrong. What is happening is life. When purpose becomes pressure, it asks you to outrun your own humanity. It asks you to ignore exhaustion, override intuition, and postpone presence for the sake of a future version of yourself that never quite arrives. It frames rest as weakness and uncertainty as danger. Buddhist teaching gently dismantles this illusion. It reminds us that life is not meant to be conquered or completed. It is meant to be experienced. When purpose is approached as a rigid demand, it pulls you out of direct experience and into constant anticipation. And anticipation is never peaceful. This does not mean abandoning goals or drifting without intention. It means loosening the grip. It means allowing purpose to breathe. When you stop forcing life to justify itself through constant achievement, something subtle but powerful happens. The body relaxes. The mind softens. The heart begins to re-enter the present moment. Purpose, in this light, is no longer something you chase. It becomes something that responds. It responds to how you show up. It responds to how you relate to your experience. It responds to the quality of attention you bring to this moment. When the pressure eases, you begin to sense a different kind of meaning. One that doesn't shout. One that doesn't demand proof. One that does not disappear the moment you stop performing. The suffering caused by purpose as pressure is not meant to punish you. It is meant to signal that something has become misaligned. That the way you are relating to your life may be more about control than connection. Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to give up on purpose. It asks you to look at what you are using purpose for. Are you using it to deepen your experience of living? Or are you using it to defend yourself against the fear of not being enough? When you see this distinction clearly, the pressure begins to loosen. Not because you found a better answer, but because you asked a more honest question. And that honesty is where a different kind of freedom quietly begins. Part 3: The Illusion of a Fixed Self. Beneath the pressure to find purpose, beneath the quiet exhaustion and the constant striving, there is something even more fragile at work. Something rarely questioned, yet fiercely protected. An idea so familiar that it feels like truth itself. The idea of who you are, not who you are in this moment, breathing, sensing, changing, but who you believe you must remain in order to matter. Over time, this idea hardens. It gathers labels. It absorbs roles, achievements, histories, expectations. Slowly, almost invisibly, it turns into something solid in the mind. This is me. This is who I am. This is what defines my life. And once the self feels solid, it becomes something that must be defended. Most people don't notice when this happens. It doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives through repetition. through introductions that reduce a life to a title, through habits of explaining yourself in ways that feel acceptable, through the quiet relief of being recognized for something the world knows how to value. Work becomes more than work. It becomes identity. Responsibility becomes more than care. It becomes proof. Consistency becomes more than stability. It becomes a shield. The self, as it forms in this way, offers a sense of certainty. And certainty feels safe in a world that changes without asking permission. But there is a cost to this safety. The moment identity is tied to something specific, fear is born alongside it. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of falling apart. Fear of no longer knowing who you are. This fear does not live on the surface. It lives quietly, shaping choices from behind the scenes. It whispers caution when change appears. It tightens the chest when familiar ground begins to shift. It turns flexibility into threat and growth into danger. From a Buddhist perspective, this fear is not a flaw. It is the natural consequence of believing in a fixed self within an impermanent world. The teachings point gently, but clearly, to a truth most people resist. There is no unchanging core that remains the same through every experience. What we call self is a process, a flow, a movement of thoughts, emotions, memories, and sensations constantly arising and passing away. The mind, however, longs for something stable, something it can hold on to and say, "This is me," and so it constructs an identity from whatever seems reliable at the time. Success, strength, being needed, being competent, being admired, being in control. But nothing constructed in this way can stay intact forever. This is why moments of disruption feel so threatening. A sudden change in direction, a loss that removes a familiar role, a realization that the life you built no longer fits the person you are becoming. These moments don't just challenge circumstances. They challenge the self-image that depended on those circumstances. And that is where the pain deepens. It is not simply the loss of a job, a relationship, or a sense of momentum that hurts. It is the question that follows, often unspoken and terrifying in its honesty: if this is gone, who am I now? The mind reacts quickly to this question. It scrambles to rebuild, to replace one identity with another, to find something new to stand on. Anything to avoid the feeling of groundlessness. But Buddhist insight invites a different response. Instead of rushing to reassemble the self, it asks you to look directly at the discomfort, to notice how much effort goes into maintaining the idea of who you think you are, to see how often fear arises not from change itself, but from the threat change poses to identity, to recognize that the suffering is not caused by losing something, but by clinging to the belief that you needed it to exist. This can feel deeply unsettling at first. The idea that the self is not fixed sounds like erasure, like instability, like loss. But the teachings reveal something paradoxical. What feels like loss to the ego is often freedom for the heart. When identity is seen as fluid, the pressure to protect it begins to soften. You no longer have to be the same person forever. You no longer have to make past versions of yourself justify the present. You no longer have to live in fear of becoming someone different. The illusion of a fixed self turns life into a performance that must remain consistent. The release of that illusion allows life to become an exploration. This does not mean you lose values, character, or depth. It means you stop confusing those qualities with rigid definitions. Compassion, awareness, and integrity do not belong to a static identity. They arise through presence. They adapt. They respond. Buddhist wisdom does not deny personality or history. It simply refuses to let them become prisons. The moment you begin to see the self as movement rather than structure, something shifts. Change feels less like failure and more like evolution. Uncertainty feels less like danger and more like openness. The need to constantly explain yourself begins to fade. You start to notice how much energy was spent holding yourself together, holding on to stories, holding on to expectations, holding on to an image of continuity in a world that is always in motion. When that grip loosens, even slightly, the heart experiences relief. Not because you have figured out who you are, but because you no longer need to. The fear of losing yourself begins to dissolve when you realize there was never a single, solid self to lose. What remains is awareness itself, the capacity to experience, to feel, to learn, to change. This awareness does not disappear when roles fall away. It does not diminish when plans collapse. It does not vanish when certainty is lost. It is still here, breathing, noticing, living. The illusion of a fixed self convinces us that safety lies in definition. Buddhist insight reveals that safety lies in flexibility, in the willingness to meet life as it unfolds, without demanding that it confirm who we think we are. When this understanding begins to settle, not as an idea, but as a felt experience, the heart becomes lighter. You may still play roles, still pursue goals, still care deeply about how you live. But the desperation fades. The fear of unraveling softens, because you are no longer holding your life together through identity alone. You are allowing it to move. And in that movement, a deeper kind of stability quietly emerges, not the stability of certainty, but the stability of presence. Part 4: Comparison, the quiet thief of peace. There is a moment that happens almost without awareness. A glance, a pause, a subtle tightening in the chest. It doesn't announce itself as harm. It often disguises itself as curiosity, inspiration, or self-improvement. But beneath it, something fragile is being taken away. Comparison rarely feels violent. It feels reasonable, almost harmless. You tell yourself you're just observing, just staying informed, just seeing what's possible. Yet each time the mind measures your life against another, something quietly fractures. Not all at once, but slowly, persistently, like erosion. Peace is not stolen in a single dramatic moment. It is drained through repetition. Comparison teaches the mind to stand outside its own life and evaluate it from a distance. Instead of inhabiting the moment you are living, you begin to watch yourself live, constantly asking whether this moment is enough, impressive enough, meaningful enough when placed beside someone else's. And the answer, almost always, feels like no. This is how comparison works. It creates an invisible scale and places your life on one side, someone else's on the other. But the scale is rigged. You compare your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel, your doubts to their certainty, your uncertainty to their confidence, your quiet moments to their visible achievements. The result is not motivation. It is disconnection. You may not even realize how often comparison shapes your emotional landscape. It appears while scrolling late at night, when the day has finally slowed and your defenses are low. It appears in conversations that leave you subtly deflated, unsure why. It appears when you accomplish something meaningful, only to feel its joy diminish the moment you see someone else has gone further. Comparison does not ask whether you are living honestly. It asks whether you are living competitively. From a Buddhist perspective, comparison is not simply a habit, it is a symptom of misunderstanding. It arises from the belief that value is relative, that worth exists only in contrast. When the mind believes that meaning must be measured, it can never rest. There will always be someone ahead, someone behind, someone different, and difference, under comparison, becomes threat. The teachings point out something quietly radical. Peace is not found by arranging your life above others. Peace arises when you stop using others as mirrors for your own value. The moment you look outward to determine your worth, you abandon the ground beneath your own feet. Comparison pulls attention away from direct experience. Instead of feeling the texture of your own life, the subtle emotions, the quiet efforts, the unseen care, you become preoccupied with an abstract ranking that has no end and no mercy. This is why comparison often leaves people feeling strangely numb. Not devastated, not broken, just hollow. Life becomes something to monitor rather than something to inhabit. You may find yourself thinking more about how your life looks than how it feels. And when appearance takes priority over presence, meaning begins to fade. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when the mind is caught in craving and aversion. Comparison feeds both at once. It creates craving for what others appear to have and aversion toward what you perceive yourself to lack. The heart is pulled in two directions simultaneously, never allowed to settle. Even gratitude becomes conditional. Even joy feels temporary. Even success feels fragile. Comparison also distorts time. It pushes you out of the present and into an imagined hierarchy. You begin to live in relation to a narrative that is not your own. Your pace no longer feels natural. Your choices feel pressured. Your path begins to bend toward what is admired rather than what is true. This distortion is subtle but profound. You may still be living your life, but you are no longer living from it. Buddhist wisdom does not suggest ignoring others or pretending differences don't exist. It invites something deeper, the recognition that every life unfolds according to conditions that cannot be compared fairly. Different causes, different timing, different inner landscapes. To compare outcomes without understanding conditions is to misunderstand life itself. When you see this clearly, the impulse to compare begins to lose its grip. You start to notice how often comparison interrupts moments that could have been complete on their own. A quiet sense of contentment cut short by an unnecessary measurement. A meaningful experience diluted by the thought that it should be more. The mind learns to stand down when it realizes there is nothing to win. Comparison thrives on the illusion that life is a race. Buddhist insight reveals that life is not a competition. It is a process. No two processes unfold in the same way, and no single metric can capture their depth. When comparison loosens, something surprising happens. Attention returns. The present moment regains its texture. You begin to feel your own life again, not as an entry in a ledger, but as a living experience. You notice small things without needing to justify them. You feel effort without demanding applause. You experience joy without immediately questioning its legitimacy. Peace does not arrive as excitement. It arrives as relief. Relief from the constant self-evaluation. Relief from the need to be ahead. Relief from the silent belief that your life must outperform another to be enough. The quiet thief loses its power the moment you stop inviting it in. When you no longer measure your life against imagined standards, the heart begins to settle into its own rhythm. A rhythm that does not need comparison to exist. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that peace is not something added to life once conditions improve. It is revealed when unnecessary comparisons fall away. When you stop asking how your life ranks, you finally begin to ask a more honest question: how am I actually experiencing this moment? And in answering that, gently, without judgment, you reclaim something comparison could never offer: your own life. Part 5. When life falls apart, truth appears. There are moments when life does not gently invite reflection. It demands it. Plans unravel. Certainty collapses. The ground you trusted gives way without warning. What once felt solid routine, direction, identity suddenly feels unreliable. And in that disorientation, a quiet fear arises: something has gone terribly wrong. But Buddhist wisdom offers a perspective that runs counter to this instinct. It suggests that when life falls apart, it is not punishing you. It is revealing something that could not be seen while everything was held together. Loss has a way of stripping life down to what is essential. Not dramatically, not poetically, but honestly. It removes the layers we use to explain ourselves. It interrupts the stories we relied on to feel safe. It exposes the invisible agreements we made with life about how things were supposed to go. And this exposure hurts. It hurts because loss does not only take away what we had. It takes away who we thought we were because of what we had. A role disappears. A future dissolves. A familiar rhythm breaks. Suddenly, there is space wide, uncomfortable, and silent. The mind rushes to fill that space. It wants answers, reasons, timelines for recovery. It wants reassurance that this disruption will make sense someday. But Buddhist teaching does not rush to close the wound. It invites you to stay with it long enough to understand it. Suffering, in this view, is not an error in the system. It is a teacher. Not a cruel one. A precise one. Loss reveals attachment with painful clarity. It shows what the heart was holding on to, often without knowing it. Not just possessions or relationships, but expectations, certainties, assumptions about fairness and control. When these fall away, the pain is sharp not because life is unjust, but because reality has stopped cooperating with illusion. This is why loss feels disorienting. It breaks the agreement between how we believed life worked and how it actually unfolds. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to what is impermanent. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. Everything that changes will eventually disappoint the part of us that wants it to stay the same. Loss simply makes this truth impossible to ignore. In moments of collapse, many people ask, "Why is this happening to me?" But Buddhist wisdom gently shifts the question. Instead of asking why, it asks what is being revealed. What belief has been challenged? What identity has been loosened? What illusion has been interrupted? These questions do not erase pain, but they change your relationship to it. When life falls apart, the usual strategies stop working. Distraction loses its power. Achievement feels irrelevant. Comparison feels hollow. What remains is raw experience: grief, fear, confusion, vulnerability. And in that rawness, something unexpectedly honest emerges. You begin to see how much of your life was spent bracing against change. How often peace depended on circumstances behaving themselves. How deeply you believed that stability was something you could secure if you tried hard enough. Loss dismantles this belief. And in doing so, it opens the door to a deeper truth: peace was never meant to come from control. Buddhist teaching does not promise that loss will make you stronger or wiser by default. It does not romanticize suffering. It simply points out that when the usual supports fall away, you are brought into direct contact with reality, impermanent, unpredictable, and alive. This contact is uncomfortable, but it is also intimate. Without the familiar distractions, you may notice how much you are still here. Breathing, feeling, responding. Even in pain, life continues to move through you. This realization can be quietly transformative. It shows that your existence does not depend on things going well. You are not erased by loss. In fact, something softer often begins to appear in these moments. A humility that replaces certainty. A tenderness toward yourself and others who are struggling. A recognition that everyone is carrying something unseen. This is where compassion is born, not as an idea, but as a lived understanding. Loss breaks the illusion that life can be mastered. It replaces it with the possibility of relationship. Relationship with uncertainty. Relationship with grief. Relationship with the present moment as it is, not as you wish it to be. Buddhist wisdom encourages you not to rush past this moment, not to immediately rebuild the same structures that failed before. It invites you to listen, to feel, to let the truth of impermanence sink into the body, not as despair, but as clarity. When you stop resisting the reality of loss, something shifts. The pain may remain, but the struggle against it softens. You are no longer fighting life for being what it is. You are meeting it. And in that meeting, meaning begins to change its shape. Meaning is no longer something guaranteed by continuity or success. It becomes something quieter, more resilient. It lives in presence, in honesty, in the courage to stay open even when certainty has vanished. When life falls apart, truth appears not as comfort, but as invitation. An invitation to release the belief that things must stay the same for life to be meaningful. An invitation to discover a depth of being that does not depend on permanence. An invitation to realize that even in loss, something essential remains untouched. You are still here, and that, in itself, carries a truth no loss can take away. Part 6. Purpose is not found, it emerges. There comes a quiet moment, often after striving has exhausted itself, when the mind finally admits something it has long resisted. Forcing meaning has never brought peace. No matter how carefully life was planned, no matter how diligently goals were pursued, purpose remained strangely elusive. It appeared briefly in moments of success, then vanished just as quickly. The harder it was chased, the more distant it seemed. And in that realization, something inside begins to soften. Buddhist wisdom speaks directly to this exhaustion. It does not suggest that purpose is hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered through effort or intelligence. It points to something far more unsettling and far more freeing. Purpose cannot be hunted without being distorted. The mind wants purpose to be a destination, a clearly defined role, a statement that explains existence in a sentence or two, something solid enough to hold on to in moments of doubt. But life does not unfold that way. Life moves, shifts, responds, and purpose, if it is real, must be able to move with it. This is why so many people feel lost, even when they are doing everything right. They are searching for meaning as if it were an object, while life is asking to be met as a process. Purpose does not live in the future version of yourself you are trying to become. It lives in the quality of attention you bring to this moment. It emerges quietly when striving relaxes and presence returns. This can feel almost disappointing at first. The ego wants something grand, something definitive, something that proves your life matters. But Buddhist insight gently dismantles this expectation. It shows that meaning does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It unfolds slowly, through participation rather than control. When you stop demanding that life explain itself, it begins to speak. Purpose emerges when actions are no longer driven by fear of inadequacy. It emerges when choices are guided by sincerity rather than image. It emerges when you are fully engaged with what is in front of you, without constantly asking what it leads to. This is difficult for a mind trained to optimize everything, to measure progress, to justify time, to turn experience into outcome. But the teachings remind us that life is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be lived. When the grip on purpose loosens, something subtle shifts in the body. The breath deepens. The nervous system settles. The constant internal negotiation, am I doing enough? Am I becoming enough, begins to quiet. In that quiet, a different kind of meaning becomes perceptible. You begin to notice the impact of small, sincere acts. The way presence changes a conversation. The way attention transforms a simple task. The way compassion alters the texture of a moment. None of this looks impressive from the outside. And that is precisely the point. Buddhist wisdom does not equate meaning with visibility. It equates meaning with alignment. When actions arise naturally from awareness rather than compulsion, they carry a depth that does not depend on recognition. This is why purpose cannot be forced. The moment it is used to prove worth, it collapses under its own weight. Forced meaning is brittle. Emergent meaning is resilient. Emergent meaning adapts. It changes with circumstances. It deepens through experience. It does not require certainty to exist. Many people fear that if they stop searching so hard, life will become empty. But the opposite is often true. It is the relentless search that creates emptiness by pulling attention away from lived experience. When that search relaxes, life begins to feel fuller, not because more has been added, but because less is being resisted. Purpose, seen this way, is not a script you must follow. It is a relationship you cultivate. A relationship with your own experience, with others, with the unfolding present. Buddhist teaching invites a radical trust here. Not blind optimism, but trust in the intelligence of awareness itself. Trust that when you meet each moment honestly, something meaningful will naturally arise from that meeting. This does not eliminate uncertainty. It reframes it. Uncertainty is no longer a sign that you are lost. It becomes a sign that life is still open. When purpose is allowed to emerge, you no longer need to know exactly where you are going to move with integrity. You respond to what is needed, rather than forcing what is imagined. You listen more closely. You act more simply. And in doing so, you discover that meaning was never absent. It was obscured by effort. The mind relaxes when it realizes it does not have to manufacture significance. The heart relaxes when it understands that living sincerely is enough. And life, no longer pressured to perform, begins to reveal its quiet coherence. Purpose does not announce itself. It unfolds. It unfolds in how you show up when no one is watching. In how you care without needing credit. In how you remain present, even when certainty is unavailable. When you stop demanding answers from life, life responds not with explanations, but with experience. And in that experience, lived fully and honestly, purpose takes shape not as a conclusion, but as a way of being. Not something you find. Something you allow. Part 7: Living like a river. There is a way life moves when it is not being forced. It does not rush, yet it does not hesitate. It does not argue with the landscape, yet it shapes it over time. It meets obstacles without resentment and changes direction without calling itself a failure. It continues not because it must arrive somewhere, but because movement itself is its nature. Buddhist wisdom often points to this quality of living, not as a metaphor to admire from a distance, but as a way of being to embody. Living like a river does not mean giving up responsibility or drifting without care. It means releasing the belief that life must be controlled in order to be meaningful. Control feels comforting, especially in a world that changes without warning. It gives the mind a sense of authority, the illusion of safety. Plans, timelines, and rigid expectations create the impression that uncertainty can be managed if we think far enough ahead. But beneath that effort, tension quietly builds. The body knows this tension well. It lives in shallow breaths, taken while anticipating the next outcome. It lives in clenched jaws and restless nights. It lives in the subtle fear that if you stop pushing, everything will fall apart. Living like a river challenges this fear at its root. It asks a simple but profound question: what if life does not require constant force to move forward? Force assumes resistance. It assumes that life must be compelled into the right shape. Flow, on the other hand, begins with listening. It responds to conditions rather than denying them. It does not abandon direction, but it does not cling to a single route. The Buddha taught that much of our suffering comes from craving things to be other than they are. Control is one of the most refined forms of craving. It disguises itself as responsibility, ambition, or preparedness. But underneath, it is often an unwillingness to trust the present moment. Trust here does not mean passivity. It means recognizing that reality has its own intelligence. When you live like a river, you still act. You still choose. You still care deeply about how you move through the world. But your actions arise from responsiveness rather than fear. You are no longer fighting life into submission. You are cooperating with its movement. This shift is subtle, but its impact is profound. Moments stop feeling like obstacles to overcome and begin to feel like information. Challenges become signals rather than verdicts. Change is no longer interpreted as evidence that something has gone wrong, but as a natural adjustment to new conditions. The river does not mourn the path it did not take. It does not replay what might have been. It meets the bend and turns. So much of human suffering comes from resisting these bends, from insisting that life continue in the direction we expected, from measuring ourselves against plans that no longer fit the reality unfolding in front of us. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that impermanence is not a flaw in existence. It is its defining feature. When you align with this truth, life becomes less of a battle and more of a dialogue. Living like a river means allowing yourself to be changed by experience without interpreting that change as loss. It means letting go of the idea that consistency is the same as integrity. You can remain honest while evolving. You can remain committed while adapting. You can remain grounded while moving. This way of living restores a sense of ease that effort alone cannot provide. The nervous system relaxes when it no longer has to defend against every unknown. The heart opens when it realizes it does not need to predict the future to participate fully in the present. Flow does not eliminate difficulty. Rivers encounter rocks, droughts, floods. But they do not personalize these conditions. They do not assign blame or create stories of inadequacy. They respond. When you begin to live this way, something inside shifts. Decisions feel clearer, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because you are listening more closely to what is actually happening. You become less attached to proving yourself and more interested in responding truthfully. The compulsion to force meaning begins to fade. Meaning arises naturally through engagement, through movement that feels honest rather than frantic, through choices guided by awareness instead of fear. Buddhist teaching calls this alignment with reality wisdom. Not wisdom as information, but wisdom as embodied understanding. The understanding that life does not need to be dominated to be lived well. When you stop pushing against the current of your own experience, you begin to feel supported by it. Not in a sentimental way, but in a grounded, practical sense. You expend less energy resisting and more energy participating. Living like a river restores a forgotten intimacy with life. Moments feel less like hurdles and more like invitations. The present becomes spacious. The future loses some of its tyranny. The past loosens its grip. You are still moving, still growing, still responding. But now, you are moving with life rather than against it. And in that movement, something deeply human reawakens a sense that you do not need to force your way into meaning. Meaning flows naturally when you allow yourself to move honestly, moment by moment, exactly where you are. Part 8: The Freedom of Being Ordinary. There is a quiet fear many people carry but rarely admit, even to themselves, the fear of being ordinary. Not unsuccessful, not unloved, but unremarkable. Somewhere along the way, life taught us that to matter, we must stand out. To be worthy, we must be exceptional. To justify our existence, we must leave a mark large enough to be noticed. This belief does not usually arrive as arrogance. It arrives as pressure, a subtle, persistent tension that whispers, "Don't disappear. Don't blend in. Don't be forgettable." And so, many people live with an unspoken urgency to be special. They strive not only to live well, but to live visibly. They measure their days by impact, influence, and recognition. Even kindness is sometimes evaluated by how far it reaches, how many it touches, how memorable it appears. Quiet goodness feels insufficient. Ordinary care feels invisible. And invisibility feels like failure. Buddhist wisdom approaches this fear with remarkable gentleness. It does not shame the desire to matter. It simply asks a deeper question: what if the need to be special is the very thing that keeps us from being free? The pressure to be exceptional places a heavy burden on the heart. It turns life into a performance, even when no one is watching. It makes stillness uncomfortable, because stillness offers no proof. It makes simple moments feel wasted, because they do not contribute to a narrative of significance. Over time, this pressure can hollow out joy. You may find yourself doing meaningful things, yet feeling strangely disconnected from them. Not because the actions lack value, but because they are constantly filtered through the question of whether they are impressive enough. Buddhist teaching reveals a quiet truth here: suffering often comes not from being unseen, but from believing that being unseen means being unworthy. The idea that value must be visible is a learned illusion. Life itself does not operate this way. Breath does not announce its importance. The heart does not demand recognition for continuing to beat. The earth does not require applause for supporting everything that grows upon it. And yet, these ordinary processes are essential. When the Buddha spoke of liberation, he did not describe it as becoming extraordinary. He described it as letting go. Letting go of craving. Letting go of comparison. Letting go of the compulsive need to elevate the self above others in order to feel secure. The freedom of being ordinary begins when you stop demanding that your life justify itself through distinction. This does not mean your life lacks meaning. It means meaning is no longer dependent on being exceptional. It becomes embedded in how you live, not how you are perceived. In the sincerity of your actions. In the care you bring to moments that may never be witnessed or remembered by anyone else. There is a profound relief in this realization. When you allow yourself to be ordinary, you no longer have to compete for space. You no longer have to fear being replaced. You no longer have to constantly reinvent yourself to remain relevant. You are free to respond to life as it is, rather than performing for an imagined audience. Ordinary moments begin to regain their dignity. Preparing a meal. Listening without interrupting. Showing up when it would be easier to withdraw. Choosing kindness when no recognition is offered. These acts do not look heroic. They do not generate applause. But they carry a depth that spectacle cannot match. Buddhist wisdom teaches that liberation is found not in grand gestures, but in the release of egoic hunger. The need to be special is closely tied to the fear of being nothing. When that fear loosens, you begin to see that being ordinary does not erase you. It returns you to yourself. You are no longer living to be remembered. You are living to be present. This shift changes how you relate to others as well. When you stop needing to stand above, you can stand beside. When you stop measuring worth through uniqueness, compassion becomes natural rather than strategic. You recognize yourself in others, not as competition, but as shared humanity. Buddhist insight reminds us that the self is not something to be inflated or defended. It is something to be understood and softened. When the obsession with being special fades, what remains is a quieter, more grounded sense of belonging. Belonging not because you are remarkable, but because you are alive. In this space, peace deepens. The nervous system rests. The constant internal demand to stand out begins to dissolve. You may still grow, still contribute, still express your gifts, but without the tension of proving that those gifts are enough. The freedom of being ordinary is not resignation. It is liberation from unnecessary struggle. It allows you to live fully without needing to be extraordinary. To care deeply without needing validation. To participate in life without insisting on center stage. And in that freedom, something unexpected happens. Life begins to feel intimate again. Moments feel complete as they are. You feel less driven to be more, and more able to be here. Buddhist wisdom does not diminish the individual. It releases the individual from the burden of self-importance. What remains is not emptiness, but ease. A quiet confidence that you do not need to be special to be meaningful. You only need to be present. Part 9 Practices for a Life that Feels Real. Understanding alone does not change a life. Insight can move the mind, but it is practice that slowly reshapes the heart. Buddhist wisdom has always known this. It does not ask you to believe in anything extraordinary. It asks you to meet the ordinary moments of your life with a different quality of attention. A life that feels real is not built through dramatic transformation. It is built through small, consistent shifts in how you relate to what is already here. Most people are not disconnected from life because they lack meaning. They are disconnected because their attention is scattered, pulled into the past, pulled into the future, pulled into comparison, judgment, and self-criticism. The body moves through the day, but awareness is rarely present for it. Buddhist practice begins with something deceptively simple: returning. Returning to the body, returning to the breath, returning to this moment without trying to improve it. This return does not require silence or retreat. It can happen in the middle of an ordinary day. In the pause before responding to a message. In the sensation of your feet touching the ground. In the brief recognition that you are here, alive, and breathing. These moments are not escapes from life. They are entrances into it. One of the most powerful practices is learning to pause without purpose. Not every pause needs to lead somewhere. Not every moment of stillness needs to be productive. When you allow yourself even a few seconds of undirected awareness, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. The constant sense of urgency softens. The body receives the message that it is safe to be here. Breathing consciously is another quiet doorway. Not as a technique to fix yourself, but as an act of companionship with your own experience. Feeling the breath move in and out reminds you that life is already happening without your effort. You do not need to control it. You only need to notice it. Over time, this noticing builds trust. A life that feels real also requires honesty. Gentle, non-punishing honesty. Buddhist practice encourages observing thoughts and emotions without immediately trying to correct them. When sadness appears, notice it. When irritation arises, acknowledge it. When fear tightens the body, feel its texture. This observation is not indulgence. It is clarity. When emotions are met with awareness rather than resistance, they move more freely. They no longer need to shout to be heard. You begin to understand your inner life, not as an enemy to conquer, but as information to receive. Another essential practice is simplifying intention. So much suffering comes from carrying too many inner demands at once. Buddhist wisdom suggests narrowing the focus. Asking, in each moment, a single question: what is needed here? Not what is impressive. Not what will be remembered. What is needed? Sometimes what is needed is action. Sometimes it is restraint. Sometimes it is rest. Sometimes it is kindness toward yourself. When intention is simplified in this way, decisions become less exhausting. You are no longer trying to optimize life. You are responding to it. Compassion, too, becomes a daily practice rather than an abstract ideal. Compassion begins with how you speak to yourself. The inner tone you use when things don't go as planned. The patience you allow when progress feels slow. The forgiveness you offer when you fall back into old patterns. Buddhist practice does not expect perfection. It expects sincerity. A life that feels real is not free from difficulty. It is free from unnecessary harshness. It allows space for mistakes without turning them into identities. It allows growth without turning it into pressure. Another quiet but powerful practice is choosing one small act of care each day without seeking acknowledgement. This could be listening fully, helping without explanation, doing something kind that will never be traced back to you. These acts dissolve the ego's need for recognition and reconnect you with the intrinsic value of goodness. When goodness is practiced without audience, it returns you to yourself. Mindfulness, compassion, and simplicity are not techniques to master. They are ways of relating. Over time, they begin to change how life feels from the inside. The days may look the same on the surface, but the experience deepens. Colors feel richer. Conversations feel more intimate. Even difficult moments feel more honest. Buddhist practice is not about becoming calm all the time. It is about becoming present enough to meet whatever arises. Presence does not eliminate pain, but it removes the loneliness that comes from fighting your own experience. A life that feels real is one where you are no longer watching yourself live from a distance. You are inside your own moments, breathing them, feeling them, responding to them with care. This is not a dramatic achievement. It is a quiet return, again and again, moment by moment. And in that return, life stops feeling like something you are missing. It begins to feel like something you are finally inhabiting. A closing reflection. This journey has not been about finding a single answer to life's biggest questions. It has been about slowly loosening the grip we hold on the wrong ones. We began by noticing the quiet question: so many people carry the sense that something essential is missing, even when life appears full. From there, we saw how the search for purpose can quietly turn into pressure, how identity hardens into something we feel forced to protect, and how comparison slowly steals our peace without ever announcing itself. As the story unfolded, one truth became clear. Much of our suffering does not come from life itself, but from the way we relate to it. We try to control what is meant to flow. We cling to what is meant to change. We measure ourselves by standards that were never designed to bring peace. And when life inevitably falls apart, as it always does in one way or another, we mistake revelation for failure. Buddhist wisdom gently reframes this entire struggle. It reminds us that loss is not a punishment, but a teacher. That purpose cannot be forced without becoming hollow. That meaning is not found by becoming extraordinary, but by being present. Like a river, life moves forward not through resistance, but through responsiveness. And when we allow ourselves to be ordinary, truly ordinary, we discover a freedom deeper than recognition or success. What emerges across this journey is a radical but quiet insight: life does not ask to be explained. It asks to be lived, fully, honestly, without the constant demand to prove that we are enough. The deeper lesson. The deepest lesson of this story is that peace is not waiting in a future version of your life. It is available the moment you stop arguing with the present. When you release the need to control, compare, and constantly define yourself, something essential returns. You reconnect with the simple reality of being alive, breathing, sensing, responding. To apply this wisdom in daily life does not require dramatic change. It begins with small, sincere shifts. Pause without purpose, even briefly. Notice your breath when the mind rushes ahead. Respond to what is needed instead of what is impressive. Offer kindness without seeking recognition. Allow yourself to be human, imperfect, and unfinished. These practices do not remove difficulty, but they soften the struggle against it. Over time, life begins to feel less like a performance and more like a relationship one you are finally present for. Now we would love to hear from you. How did this story resonate with your own life? What part spoke to you most deeply? Do you agree, disagree, or see this journey differently? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can reflect and learn from your perspective as well. Your insight may be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if this kind of calm, honest reflection supports you, please subscribe to Buddhism in every moment. Your support helps this channel continue creating thoughtful, meaningful content that meets life exactly as it is. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for choosing to live with awareness, one moment at a time.